welcome to our channel, where we set out to explore wonderful, great works of literature
while dressed in elegant clothing,
because
why the hell not?
Well, thank you for joining us this evening. Today we're going to have a little bit of a double show, a double feature. And the books are going to be slightly related in the sense that they both have a gothic element to them. One is more of a, I guess, a parody on the gothic story. This is going to be no, not that one. It's going to be this one. The Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey. And so we could get to it first, maybe. She kind of like, does a little bit of a cheeky little critique of sort of the gothic stories and the sort of the naivete about these gothic stories and how young girls kind of get like drawn in by that.
In particular, Anne Radcliffe's
work.
Yeah.
And so we kind of wanted at first to just maybe read an Anne Radcliffe novel. I've read before the Italian. It's up on our shelf, but it's a pretty substantial book. So we figured we'd want to present a video before 3 months was up. So we didn't have time to read it. So we decided we'd go ahead and read E.T.A. Hoffman collection of short stories. We've decided to pick one in particular called The Sandman. And many of you might be familiar with sort of the legend of the Sandman. What's interesting about Hoffman is that he's one of his earlier precursors of this weird fiction. Like, he blends fantasy, supernatural, romance, mystery, and the absurd. Like, there's something oddly unsettling about and uncanny about a lot of his stories.
Yeah,
right?
So on one hand we have Jane Austen's poking fun at the influence that Gothic novels have on young ladies.
Yeah.
And then on the other hand we have a real Gothic tale.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So very interesting. So should we take up the first one?
Sure.
Okay. So I'm not sure if Jane Austen really requires much of an introduction. But she was born in 1775. She was the seventh child of a country rector. She lived in Steventon in Hampshire until 1801, and then she moved to Bath. Oh, interesting, because it takes place in Bath.
Mostly in Bath, yeah.
Exactly, yeah. So, she's very much known for Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice. There's been like endless sort of renditions of those films, and whatnot. And, certain takes of that genre, even in contemporary literature, a lot of people like, there's Pride and Prejudice and zombies.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if you really
Modern
got into
day Pride and Prejudices, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's she's obviously well beloved and well known in the sort of in the world of literature. Mm-hmm. But this one is light. It's very light. It's very fluffy.
Yeah, it leaves you with a warm feeling.
In what way? In what way?
That a nice lesson has been learned, but no one's really harmed.
And in a sense, that's a lot of Jane Austen's novels are like that, aren't they? They tie up nicely. The loose ends are tied up nicely in the end, right?
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on this? Did we want to touch upon a little bit of the particulars of the book or certain themes that emerged? What emerged for you?
Themes that emerged. I think it has a lot to do with the naivety of a young country girl going into society for the first time, and her experience with people who maybe aren't so truthful or may have other motives behind their actions, and her innocence towards that. So we're similar in the sense, we were talking about this before, similar to the idea of the previous book we read, Goriot.
Old Goriot.
Old Goriot, but with a light ending, where, the character who is maybe not as worldly is initiated into this society for the first time. Yeah,
and it's really a matter of kind of becoming an adult, from childhood innocence to sort of a fully fledged adult, with sort of the knowledge that comes with that transition.
Yeah.
And it's not necessarily like bitterness or whatever, or, she doesn't get necessarily jaded. But so this girl is, she's moderately pretty. She's the way Jane Austen describes her is like she bloomed essentially, and she was almost pretty, almost considered
almost like
pretty.
An ugly duckling story where she didn't have like usually she pokes fun at this idea of the heroine always being like otherworldly beauty kind of thing, and this one wasn't. She was just relatively pretty, but you know, she was happy for people to call her pretty alone.
Yeah, you know? And I would say a little bit of a tomboy. Like she was really much.
She grew up, right?
She grew up in sort of in a country, sort of like country village, and so she was very much close with nature and in her head, in her imagination, quite a bit. And so as she
scatterbrain, they called her scatterbrain.
Scatterbrain. Her mom called her scatterbrain. So as she's like 17 years old, around this time, she sort of like moves to Bath with the Allens, Mr. and Mrs. Allen.
Yeah.
And they kind of are kind of her initiates to help her kind of bring her into society, polite society. Yeah. And so they take the waters at Bath, and you know, this is a place where a lot of sort of very wealthy people used to go to drink sort of the medicinal type waters, the seltzer type waters of Bath, as for rejuvenative purposes, right? Mm-hmm. And so this entire book is kind of interspersed with her romantic fancies, where you know, she's on a carriage and she's like hoping that, you know, imagining brigands or, you know, some sort of like, you know, some hooligans to, you know, stop the carriage and, you know, ravish her or something always like romantically scary happens.
She visits the Abbey for the first time and she's picturing something evil happening, and her imagination kind of takes over her common sense. Yeah. And even almost etiquette and decency, she totally disregards in this pursuit of something kind of romantic but also dramatic. Yeah.
And so she befriends a very pretty young girl named Isabella, and they become very close friends. Mm-hmm. And just through all these different sort of associations, she's quite idolizes her friend. It's kind of like a really innocent relationship at first, and you can tell that there's something not quite right about Isabella. She's a little bit attention-seeking, and she talks out of sort of both sides of her mouth, if you will.
Almost their entire family was, from the introduction, they're very much about, like, they talk the talk, right? Yeah, yeah. And so it's just someone who has any experience in the world, they see through that right away and see what they're saying for what it is. But then, as a young, innocent person being first introduced to this idea, she was confused. But it makes her a great heroine in a way, right? Because it's a different perspective on the socialite world. Yeah, very interesting. And so through this experience, she makes a few misjudgments and errors, and but on the way she meets this handsome, I think he's like a parson, named Mr. Tilney, and meets her sister, and she forms a bond and a relationship with them. And they have a father who's very severe and very like commanding. He's a General Tilney. And we're not going to give away much of the plot, but she makes a few different picadillos. She makes a few little errors. Yeah, which are fun.
Which are understandable, right? But she grows out of it, and it all ends rather happily. So it was quite a pleasurable light read, like you said, right?
And did you feel like, what do you feel about the characters? Did you have a particular favorite, or one you really felt was frustrating, or what did you? I found
Isabella's brother to be rather loathsome. He was like, she did
a good job of making him so.
And there was like a few instances where he's like obviously conniving and sort of like misleading or like moving Catherine, the main character, you know, away from her interaction with her love interest. And I felt that particularly schemy and very like unpleasant.
I didn't find that he was so schemy as much as he was a boastful young man who ignored etiquette so he could get his desires. Yeah. Like, I felt it was really selfish motive. I didn't find him conniving as much as some of the other characters.
I think instead of using the word schemy, I think what I was trying to reach for was skeezy. Oh. There was something very skeezy about it.
He was a scrub.
He was a scrub, yeah, there we go. But I found him rather unpleasant. Yeah. And Isabella as well. And it's just very interesting because they're all very, like, Isabella's character is very subtle. Like, she's very subtle in her, you can tell what she's thinking if you're obviously, you know, you understand human nature, you've been in the world, you've met these type of people. And there isn't anything necessarily sinister in what she was doing, but when she writes it, and through Catherine's eyes, but also how Jane Austen writes it, you know that person. And there's there's a very...
Even maybe within yourself at one point, right?
Yeah.
It's a very, like, young...
But there's also something, like,
trait.
But there's also, like, she was able to give it a little bit of a weightiness that makes it... That's what I find interesting about some of these Victorian novels. Like, these very subtle, nuanced things that, you know, in the modern day and age, we kind of see it, identify it, and then we kind of move on. But because these little interactions, and there are certain decorums that are supposed to be observed more strongly and readily, it becomes even more amplified. It becomes more of a, oh my gosh.
The trivial thing becomes more palpable.
Well, what we would consider rather trivial, or we're like,
in
okay.
their time wouldn't be,
Yeah, and I found that interesting because I found myself kind of going into the shoes of Catherine and being more shocked at Isabella's behavior and more judgmental of Isabella's behavior than I would be in today's day and age. I mean...
You brush it off as a... Right?
Oh, it's this person. Yeah, they're like completely vain. They're full of themselves. But
it's interesting because like the other characters see it for what it is. It's only Catherine who somehow is. You get drawn into this story about her discovery of this for the first time.
Yeah, and you're almost in a way also a little bit protective of her.
Yeah,
protective of her innocence.
Yeah,
in a way.
It's like the first introduction to a cynical light on things.
Yeah, and I wouldn't say the book wasn't cynical itself.
No, it's just this idea that there could be people out there who are doing things not out of their best interest.
Best faith in something, or honesty.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It was interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, so shall we move on to our short story?
Oh, this was awesome.
Yeah.
I don't like short stories, and I'm like,
I love short stories.
Just turned. I think like this is the first short story that I was like, wow, yeah.
So let me introduce.
I like this one.
Let me yeah. glowing reviews from
in just sound effects.
So what's interesting? So this author was born in Prussia. Hoffman was born in Königsberg in 1776, and he later substituted Amadeus for Wilhelm out of admiration for Mozart. Having studied law, he entered the Prussian civil service. He held a number of legal posts. He wanted his earliest ambition was to be a graphic artist and painter. He's well known also for his music theory and his music criticism. Like he was it was a reviewer of music and a critic. Yeah, very well rounded. And he was the promulgator of Beethoven. He was one of the first reviewers of Beethoven.
Oh, that's fascinating.
Yeah. So he's considered a romantic writer. But the thing is, what's interesting about Hoffman is that he is the precursor for a lot of horror and fantasy novels that we have today. A lot of that sort of genre can be rooted back in Hoffman stories. And here it says he exploited the element of the grotesque and the bizarre in a manner unmatched by any other romantic writer. And he died in 1822. And just one more little piece of trivia is that Offenbach, who is the librettist, the composer, he actually ended up creating an opera called The Tales of Hoffman. I believe that's correct. I could be wrong, but I believe it's called The Tales of Hoffman. And in it, he actually takes a piece of this story from the Sandman, one of the scenarios from the Sandman, and he actually uses it in his own plot as a plot device. And very interesting. Just if you're interested in opera, if you enjoy opera, that might be something you want to explore further.
Cool.
Yeah. So.
Very interesting.
Shall we?
Yeah.
You want to take it away?
So.
How did you want to approach this one?
There's so many different. Well, I'm a huge fan of any sort of fairy tale or folklore or ancient stories from any ancient civilization.
Yeah. Any tradition.
Any tradition, yeah. And I love how many different realities the folklore presents. You know what I mean? So the Sandman, maybe you want to start with introduction of the Sandman generally.
And so
for those, I'm sure everyone has an idea that it's this kind of boogeyman who comes and puts dust in children's eyes to make them fall asleep for some sort of evil purpose, but you know a little bit more about Sandman.
I mean, I didn't, to be honest, know much about the Sandman before reading this. Like, I've heard about the Sandman, and I've heard about that thing about the dust in the eyes so the children fall asleep vaguely. So, without giving too much of the short story, because honestly, you should read the short story for yourself. Like, we're not gonna, and we don't want to ruin it in any way. So, the basic, and it's kind of revealed a little bit through, in the story. The particular version of the tale they're going for in the Sandman is that
because there's different variations.
There are very different variations,
the Sandman,
of course.
Story, right?
So
just like any fairy tale.
So he sprinkles. So the idea is that it sprinkles dust in the eyes, and if you have dust in your eye, you can't open your eyes. So it forces children to sleep. It's kind of something that adults would tell their children. You better go to bed now, otherwise the Sandman will get you.
He'll only come if children don't go to bed.
Yeah. So he's kind of like this kind of like punitive character, right? And so in this particular version of the story, I mean, it could be true to the original, and so these are like kind of Germanic sort of folk tales. He ends up sprinkling hot dust on the children's eyes and allows their eyes to pop out of their sockets. And then he collects their eyeballs, and then he flies to the moon.
Can you imagine telling your children this today?
Yeah, where there's a nest of his children who have deformed beaks like owls, and he feeds the eyeballs of these naughty children to these owl children. Yes.
Such a beautiful thing.
With that story, you're definitely going to fall asleep as a child, right? Yeah. And so the central character here, his name is Nathaniel, and there's something neurotic about Nathaniel. He's one of those very stereotypically romantic with the capital R characters. He's very in touch with his emotions, his feelings, how he's very poetic. He's very imaginative, and he's very gloomy. And there's something, this is, you can find that in many countless poets and sort of writers of this romantic period. Yeah. So he does have these sort of like Werther, like Goethe's Werther sort of sentiments and sort of melodrama. But he recounts, a lot of this story is epistolary, so it's written in letters. Mm-hmm. And so one of them, he's writing to his love interest, Clara, and then Clara, he's best friends with Clara's brother Lothario, essentially is how it works. So through these different letters, he's kind of confessing to his friend and inadvertently to Clara, certain experiences that he had as a child with the Sandman character, who's always kind of plagued him throughout his life. And there was this particular incident late at night where his father...
Maybe don't share that one.
Well, I'll just say the father would be visited.
It's like main plot.
No, I'm not going to give it away. But father was visited by this murky, mysterious Sandman character, and without giving anything away, this Sandman character reemerges throughout Nathaniel's life, even as an adult, in various guises. And there's something similar about these characters who he sees the Sandman in, but something slightly different. But the essence of the Sandman he can tell is there in this person, or these people, or whoever they are, right? Yeah. And so essentially, it's he descends into a form of madness, and even throughout you wonder, is this a reliable witness? Like, this man must be mad. And what this novel does an excellent job of through Clara is that she also provides a very relatively rational explanation of what it is that he's feeling when he's feeling particularly haunted and tormented by this shadowy figure, right?
Rational to a degree, but I don't think that she was an overly rational person. I think it was more she was actually trying to help him, whether his ego was willing to receive that criticism or not. She was opening up his shadow side to himself and saying to him, maybe there's some of your own doing here that you're not conscious of, right? That you're creating your own misery without even realizing it. And because he was somewhat, I think there was a part of him that was allured to this idea of darkness being something his conscious state wanted to receive, like almost that he was deserving of suffering. The author said at one point he felt guilty of his father's death. He thought that his mother also felt that he was the one to blame for his father's death. And so I think a part of him felt like that he deserved to be punished by being unhappy and having these things haunt him.
Because like the whole time he's explaining how he's very much plagued by this shadowy sort of Sandman, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that's an interesting take that, you know, it's almost like in an unconscious way he's punishing himself in a way, right?
Maybe not that he wants that, but that he felt deserving of it.
Deserving of it, right?
And,
yeah.
You know, also this like, I think that Clara was very reflective and understood the power of believing. So I lost track of thought because of the talking.
Yeah.
But I think she was very reflective and understood that this darkness inside of you can take control.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't reflect on it, like there was also the profound dreams he was having, and he was afraid of them. He wasn't willing to face them and willing to understand how it was impacting his conscious state.
Yeah. And he was kind of, in a sense, like projecting it on a psychological level. He was kind of projecting this shadowy self, if you will, this aspect, this dark aspect of his personality. He was projecting it out onto Clara, onto this other character, onto this other character, you know, onto the Sandman. And it's like, once again, it's not to necessarily even deny, when I speak psychologically, I don't mean to deny the spiritual and supernatural aspect of it, because I think you would also agree that, you know, the mind itself becomes almost like a magical vessel, whereby sort of like projection is essentially a transmission of particular type of psychic energies onto something else that are moving out from the sort of the inner world into the outer world, and the outer world is also affecting the inner world, right? So
yeah, like I think in a way one could interpret Claire as being cold, or like people kept describing her as that, as like cold or a rational thinker, but I don't think it was that. I believe it was more that she understood the power he had upon himself, and that although it may not have been a conscious choice he was making, that there was a reflection that needed to be done in order for him to overcome that darkness that kept creeping in. And in a way, he unconsciously kept letting that come back. Like there were moments where there was a decision for him to make, and he allowed the darkness to open upon himself, because that control, he wasn't conscious of how it was controlling him. And I think the point I'm trying to make is that it can relate to even today, and how it's not that we consciously have control over our ability for darkness to come into our life. Like darkness and suffering is part of every human experience, but we can become a victim to it and allow ourselves to continue to think that, like, give it control in a sense of maybe we feel on one level we deserve it, or maybe on some level we feel it's part of our purpose to have this identity of being a suffering individual. But a lot of us, you know, it takes reflection and meditation to understand that we can reflect upon what's happening unconsciously, whether that's through dreams, as Jung would say, right?
And interesting on that point is, like, Freud actually wrote an essay specifically on this short story by Hoffman, The Sandman. And, like, think what you will of Freud with his little pet theories here and there, right?
He has a reputation for having, like, he's quite a profound philosopher, or not philosopher, psychologist, but he has a bad rap, really.
Yeah.
For all his.
Well, yeah, he was like a neurologist, actually. He trained as a neurologist, and he's like kind of credited for, you know, bringing into the mainstream and sort of into public consciousness the realities of the psyche, that there is an unconscious within us, right? Obviously, I think Jung is a more profound thinker in that regard, but the fact that this short story didn't escape the attention, and many of Hoffman's stories didn't escape the attention of these psychoanalysts, is very interesting. You know, there's something deep here.
Yeah. And what I also liked about it was that it played on this idea of, okay, we can have an easy relationship that fuels our ego into allowing us to think that we're this grand person, right? That, you know, and it makes me think of when you first start dating someone and there's this moment of disagreement, but perhaps you keep yourself quiet on that perspective to not rock the boat or create conflict, so that, you know, you again inflate their ego a little bit to get in their good graces, so that you can continue to date and they think of you highly, right? But what I liked about this too is there was a component of it where it was the allure of doing that is even greater when there's so much pressure on someone to formulate a relationship with someone else. And if family inheritance, if your place in society is all banking on this one relationship going smoothly, and that's your purpose in life, is to fulfill this duty of finding this person and being faithful to them and having that please them, then how much pressure is there going to be upon yourself to discover yourself?
Yeah.
And all the blind spots of yourself. So I think it played on this idea of love, and it's this allure of finding the perfect match. And we all know that serial dater who will keep searching for the perfect person, but the perfect person isn't someone who's a mirror of yourself.
Right.
The perfect person is going to show your shadow, whether your ego wants to hear that or not.
Yeah.
Because that's truly what's going to make you, or help be a catalyst for you becoming a better person.
Yeah, transforming.
Transformative part of yourself, right? So I thought that was very just well crafted, and it did it in a way that it didn't remove the magic of all that happening too.
Right. Yeah. It's very insightful psychologically.
Yeah.
I think, like, it doesn't matter when you read this book, it will have its validity. It will always be relevant. And I think that's part of the sort of the magic of Hoffman, I think, that he can write so well, almost like just the way myths and folk tales kind of operate, is that there's a perennial nature to them. They're always eternal because they're about you and me. They're not just sort of abstractions or things that are just simply done for pleasure's sake, stories for story's sake. Like, everything about us is through story. Everything, the humans and stories are intertwined.
Yeah, it's not just about you and me. It's like about beyond you and me. It's
the human condition.
Yeah, and all of us have the desire to just continue to fulfill what our ego wants, which is making ourselves feel better, right?
Yeah.
So that's a part of it. And then it's also the alluring component of darkness, and how, I mean, it's the same reason why we're attracted even to a gothic story. There's something unnerving about it that's also satisfying.
Yeah. 100%. I would very much agree. So shall we just go ahead and just rate these?
Sure.
Okay, then I guess the first one you wanna start off with? Okay. So this one I'll rate it 3.4 out of 5.
3.4. I give it a 3.2.
Yeah.
Fluffy, light, maybe not as provocative in how you, or not as thought-provoking. I shouldn't say provocative, but I guess it wasn't as provocative.
It wasn't provocative either, really. It was a rather surface level, superficial. It was like a story of a young girl growing up.
Yeah.
Which is nice. I mean, I'm sure we can all
relate
to
the
that.
main character for sure.
Yeah, and I think you were also mentioning that Jane Austen also, you can see her in.
Yeah, well, I imagine hearing that she is the 7th child of a family living in the country. Yeah. It's like, well, there's the whole basis of the main character, so you wonder, you know.
Absolutely. And so, what do we think about this one?
That one, I'd give it a 4.9. The only reason why I didn't give it a 5 is because, and this is, I actually like the spooky elements of the gothic and mystical component. It really provokes this fun, magical feeling inside, and it also captures the essence of what folklore is all about. But the only reason why I didn't give it a 5 is because I like fluffy, nice, beautiful endings that tie up lovely and they're not gory in the end.
I don't mind gore in the middle, but I don't like gore in the end.
Well, yeah, it's
So
hard
if you
to escape that.
if
with
you
the Gothic
took these
novel.
2 books and they made love, then I'd be happy. Anyway,
I would definitely give it a 5. I would give it a 5.
you like the horror ending.
I do, and I have a significant collection. I used to I collected quite a bit of Gothic stories and horror, and I like sort of the 20th century and 19th century and 18th century sort of like Gothic stories and short stories in particular.
Yeah.
And I would say this one's one of the best ones I've read in a long time, if not definitely up on the top 10 list of stories.
I have a question. Would you have liked it if it ended with a happier ending?
It would have been more Gothic romanticism if it ended happily.
Okay,
Like
I did a Gothic romanticism.
I feel like Anne Radcliffe's Italian kind of has a little bit more of that, like, you know, the lover's escape or something. You know, a little bit more of a Romeo. No, maybe not Romeo and Juliet. That's not.
Maybe
exactly
maybe I relate even more to Catherine in this.
Yeah, quite possible.
Anyway,
all right.
Thank you for joining us as
Yes,
always. Happy
yes.
Valentine's Day.
Yes,
Happy Family Day. Thank you for taking time out of your lives to come join us tonight on this long evening.
Yes, and
long weekend evening.
we hope you get to bed at a very nice early time, and you get to bed and sleep
What if
well
they
before
want to stay up in Barbie
well before the Sandman comes and gets and
I
plucks out
see,
your
I
eyes.
see.
Yes.
Oh.
Well, thank you for joining us again tonight, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Yes. Please tell us your the different things you've unveiled in either story that maybe we missed.
Yeah.
Okay.
Take care for now. Bye bye.
Bye bye. Cheers.
Cheers.